Good morning, everyone. My name is Nicole Barone. The aim of this inquiry is to gather evidence and information and build a comprehensive picture of the scope and impact of family violence throughout New South Wales. I am here to discuss the prevalence and economic, social, and health costs of domestic violence, cultural and systemic practices, and community and cultural attitudes and norms which impact on the issue. Before we begin, though, I would like to acknowledge that we are located on the lands of the Kamigal people. The Kamigal are the traditional custodians of this land and are part of the Greater Eora Nation. We pay our respects to past, present, and future ancestors of the Aboriginal nations. The New South Wales Ministry of Health acknowledges that we are located on the lands of the Kamigal people. The Kamigal are the traditional custodians of this land and are part of the Greater Eora Nation. We pay our respects to the past, present, and future ancestors of the Aboriginal nations. Thank you. Throughout this presentation, you will see an artwork used that is called Rising from the Depths by Benjamin Moody and was commissioned by Our Watch. This art piece is dedicated to those experiencing and impacted by domestic and familial violence. The feminine figure beneath the surface of the water aims to express the struggles victims may feel as they seek out their healing. The water lilies sitting on the surface of the water represent hope. The red lines depict bloodlines, loved ones, families, and generations impacted one way or another by domestic and familial violence. The green lines depict resilience and strength of the spirit as the leaves keep afloat and grow through adversity. The yellow dots depict the support available from the wider community to assist the victim in their journey to break free from the domestic and familial violence cycle. The white silver dots have dual meanings. Firstly, the separation at the flower's core expresses the difficulty victims may experience while seeking support to work through domestic and familial violence situations. And secondly, the joining at the flower's core shows the strength in a holistic approach where combining family, self, and community helps the spirit to rise above. Domestic violence is a silent but deadly shadow looming over New South Wales. But it is not surprising that our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities have fallen through the gap of our protective services and experience family and domestic violence at higher rates than the general population. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women are more likely to be hospitalised due to domestic violence, murdered by their own family members in interpersonal violence, and also more likely to have a child taken away and child services intervene compared with non-Indigenous women. Domestic violence against women encompasses all the forms of violence that can be experienced, which includes physical, sexual, emotional, cultural, and financial violence. The prevalence of domestic and family violence amongst Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities in New South Wales places a huge burden on communities, especially the women and children. This disproportionate level of family violence needs to be understood within the historical, social, and political context of time. Their cultural disposition over the past 200 years has eroded the social fabric of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities and resulted in social, economic, physical, psychological, and emotional problems for Indigenous Australians. Family violence amongst Indigenous communities needs to be viewed through the lens of social disadvantage and intergenerational trauma. The genocidal nature of violence that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have suffered in the past during the colonisation period provides the context in which the women from these communities experience violence, and it is markedly different from general society. There are cultural and systemic practices that have become ingrained within these communities over time, as they have experienced the intersecting levels of socioeconomic disadvantage, systemic and structural racism that have multiple layers of prejudice, disadvantage, poverty, and the gendered inequality that colonisation has brought into their community. In pre-colonial times, interpersonal violence was not a part of the traditional culture, and in pre-colonial times, women were actually deeply respected and a celebrated and protected part of society. Research suggests that the kind of domestic and family violence we see being expressed within Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities now is interconnected with the broader historical context of the ongoing colonial and racist violence that these communities experience through the oppression, discrimination, and inequality they face within a broader context. Family violence is the preferred term for violence within Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, as it covers the extended family and kinship relationships in which violence can occur. The issue of family violence is particularly compounded within these communities due to the fear and distrust the general community has of police and the justice system and other government agencies. Many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people experience extreme anxiety and even fear when they need to interact with police, healthcare, and welfare agencies due to the erosion of trust and trauma caused throughout the past 200 years. There is also cultural reasons that it might be hard for women to access help from outside of their community, as they usually live in remote areas in small close-knit communities where everyone in the community would know if the woman had gone outside of their group for help. There could be serious repercussions or consequences for accessing outside intervention or support services. It is important to take these differences into account. It means that in order to appropriately respond to the issue of domestic and family violence within Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, we require a trauma-informed, culturally sensitive, and needs-based approach that actually meets the needs of the women and children of these communities where they are at, and not where we dictate they should be. We invest a lot of time and energy into identifying, researching, and trying to respond to the problem of domestic violence in Australia. This is because it is the leading contributor to death, disability, and illness for women aged between 15 to 44 years old in Australia. The health cost to us as a nation is $21.7 billion per year. The real cost to the women and children of these communities are that they may not reach their full potential to thrive unless they receive specialised, tailored recovery support. There are ongoing generational levels of trauma caused by the exposure to domestic violence and family abuse. We need to mitigate the longer term impacts of domestic and family violence on women and children and the broader communities to address their cultural, psychological, and systemic practices that become ingrained within a community. This will require a whole of community approach to change the attitudes, behaviours, and underlying drivers that perpetuate the violence and abuse that enables it to thrive within our communities. In addition to the physical and mental health impacts for those who experience family and domestic violence, there are economic costs associated with the premature mortality amongst those who experience it, healthcare services to assist those who have been affected, and counselling and social welfare supports to treat the longer term impacts of the trauma resulting from domestic and family violence. There are huge costs attributed to the caring for children, both psychologically and physically, as associated social welfare programs are employed by the government in the intervention and treatment of children affected by family and domestic violence. Going forward, we need to be investing in the capacity building of these communities to increase their level of autonomy for a further increase in social capital and resilience. There are many burdens and costs associated with domestic and family violence, and we are already paying a hefty price with our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women and children suffering the most. We need to break the cycle of violence and work collaboratively to help bring peace to these communities. In my conclusion, the aim of this inquiry was to gather evidence and information and build a comprehensive picture of the scope and impact of family violence throughout New South Wales. I discussed the prevalence, economic, social, and health costs of domestic violence, the cultural and systemic practices and community and cultural attitudes and norms which impact on the issue. In conclusion, I would like to remind us of the resource that we used throughout this presentation, Rising from the Depths, the beautiful painting by Benjamin Moodoo. This art piece was dedicated to those experiencing or impacted by domestic and familial violence. He wants to remind us that the feminine figure beneath the surface of the water is expressing the struggles that victims feel as they seek out their healing, but that the water lilies sitting on the surface of the water represent their hope. The red lines are depicting bloodlines of loved ones, families, and generations that have impacted one way or another by domestic and familial violence. The green lines depict the resilience and strength of spirit as the leaves keep afloat and grow through adversity. The yellow dots depict the support available from the wider community to assist the victim in their journey to break free from the domestic and familial violence cycle. The white and silver dots that have dual meanings. The separation at the flower's core expresses the difficulty victims may experience while seeking support to work through domestic and familial violence situations, but that also the flower's core shows the strengths in a holistic approach where combining family, self, and community helps the spirit to rise above. Here is a list of the resources used throughout my project today.